Hello everyone, another month has gone by, which means it's time for another one of these things. I've got a lot of movies to cover today, although not necessarily all the ones that I thought I would be covering. I got kind of ambitious this month and took a lot of movies out of the library, and then didn't make it through the whole stack before the month was over. So there were things that I thought would be covered on this month's list, and you'll just have to wait until what else I saw in May to hear about them. Movie number one, it doesn't really matter. The only person who really cares is me, so it's fine. Movie number one is 1967's Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, directed by Stanley Kramer, starring Spencer Tracy, Katharine Hepburn, and Sidney Poitier, in which broad-minded parents Tracy and Hepburn are rattled when their daughter returns home with the black doctor she met on vacation, announcing their intention to marry. I thought I hadn't seen the whole thing before, but as it turns out, I must have seen all but the first 10 minutes, 5 minutes, 2 minutes. I always find it difficult to talk about films that are loaded with significance, and this one falls into that category. It's significant culturally, socially, even just from a classic film fan's perspective, it's significant. This was Spencer Tracy's final film, shooting wrapped just a couple weeks before his death, and the film was released 6 months later. It marked his last screen teaming with Katharine Hepburn, with whom he'd co-starred in 8 other films, and more importantly, they'd been in a not-so-secret relationship for 25 years, which makes his character's intense profession of love for Hepburn's character in the climactic scene feel almost too real. Adding to the close-to-home atmosphere is the fact that their daughter is played by Hepburn's real-life niece, Catherine Houghton, making her big-screen debut. Sidney Poitier shines, of course, as always. He passed away in January, sadly, another classic film icon gone. His character is a man who exudes confidence, and yet the way he gets flustered is so natural, with the self-conscious laughter and the way he sometimes clears his throat right in the middle of his lines. As strong as the lead performances are, and Hepburn has a great scene where she disposes of a nosy employee, there are also gems in the supporting cast, Cecil Kellaway's cheery Monsignor, and B. Richards giving a moving performance as Poitier's mother. The film's full of neat little moments, like the zoom into a Dutch angle when Tilly bursts in the room to confront John, and what I assume was the happy accident when Tracy, in high dudgeon, tries to yank one tie off the rack and they all slide off onto the floor. It's a surprisingly active film, I would say, despite being dialogue-heavy. The camera maintains movement and flow as characters walk around the house, splitting into pairs to discuss various angles of this controversial issue. It deals with the topic of interracial marriage with honesty and complexity, not just as a one-sided thing. The dismay comes not just from her parents, but from his. In fact, the ones most vehemently opposed to it are his father and Tilly, her family's maid. What may strike modern viewers as odd is that there aren't nearly as many objections raised to the age difference or the rushed nature of this marriage. That's what I would have a problem with. They met just 10 days ago, getting to know each other on vacation in Hawaii, which isn't exactly a realistic setting. And she's a bubbly 23, while he's a 37-year-old widower. That's a pretty noteworthy difference. And not only have they decided to get married, she's bent on getting married in just 2 weeks. And then, in the course of the film, she decides, hey, why wait 2 weeks? Let's do it tonight! My one complaint, and I'm pretty sure my mom would disagree with me on this one, is that the music, that Glory of Love theme song, gets played over and over again in various forms, and it's an earworm, and it gets a little tiresome. But that's a small criticism for an otherwise great movie, one that should continue to be relevant in a society obsessed with skin color. Movie number 2 is 1936's The Man Who Changed His Mind. This British film features an interesting twist on the mad scientist trope, with Boris Karloff playing a respected doctor who tarnishes his reputation with strange experiments on the transference of animal brains. Anna Lee plays a fellow scientist who has faith in him and agrees to assist in his work against the advice of her boyfriend, played by John Loder. But when Karloff's Dr. Lorenz finds his work threatened and ridiculed, he takes retaliatory measures. It's a spooky little sci-fi tale, complete with mad genius and funky lab, plus some lightly suggested commentary on the brain, the soul, personality, and the duality of man. Karloff is great and works well opposite Anna Lee, with whom he'd co-star in a very different way in 1946's Bedlam, and she plays well off of John Loder, with whom she'd co-star the following year in Nonstop New York, which I talked about a couple months ago. That's how I found this movie. Some of the performances are rather broad, but I think that's partly by design. A character acting in a certain exaggerated fashion makes it easier to recognize the transference of mannerisms when, well, I don't want to give it all away. You can find this one in very good quality on YouTube. You may also find it referred to as The Man Who Lived Again or The Brain Snatcher. Movie number 3 is 2003's Secondhand Lions, a charming film set in the 60s in which Haley Joel Osment is left by his flaky but avaricious mom, Kyra Sedgwick, to spend the summer on the wild property belonging to his two cranky great-uncles, Michael Caine and Robert Duvall. They are alleged to have a vast fortune hidden away somewhere on that property, and his mother wants him to find it. You can probably predict how this goes to a certain extent. The old guys want nothing to do with the kid, and he's scared and miserable for a while until they find common ground and become buddies. The film still has surprises, though, in addition to being heartwarming and funny, with some fantastical and kind of corny swashbuckling flashbacks thrown in. Michael Caine and Robert Duvall are endearing, especially Caine, who's the gentler soul. Duvall's character is the rougher, more edgy one, and adolescent Haley Joel Osment gives a solid performance, showing sensitivity and great comedic timing, as well as chemistry with his elder co-stars. It's a nice, old-fashioned, coming-of-age family film with fun, artistic end titles to boot, written and directed by Tim McCanlies, who also wrote that wonderful animated film, The Iron Giant. Movie number 4. Okay, so I've got some unfinished business with the Star Wars sequel trilogy. I saw The Force Awakens in 2016 and reviewed it. I saw The Last Jedi in 2018 and did a mini review of it. Then The Rise of Skywalker came out, and nothing I heard or saw about it made me want to watch it. But that kept bugging me. Not because I was just so curious about it, but because I didn't like leaving that whole thing undone. So I decided last month to just get it over with and checked all 3 movies out of the library so I could refresh my memory on the first 2 and judge the trilogy as a whole. And I watched the first 2 within a couple days of each other, and then I put off watching The Rise of Skywalker for 5 more weeks until just before it was due back. And that actually hasn't happened yet. I'm filming this, and I still haven't watched it. I'm gonna watch it today, probably today. I don't think I'll put it off one more day, and then I'll film the rest of this video. I'll have watched it in May, not in April, but whatever. I want to cover it all in one go, and then be done with it. So, movie number 4 is Star Wars Episode VII, The Force Awakens, directed by J.J. Abrams. I liked this one well enough when I saw it the first time, but when Star Wars fans collectively started to turn against it, I began to doubt myself. I barely remember anything I said in my review besides some predictions which turned out to be wrong. In general, I don't feel that video aged well, and whenever someone comments on it, I think, ew, no, don't watch that. This second time around, I came to the conclusion that The Force Awakens isn't that bad a film. There are some spots that lag, but I think it maintains a pretty good focus on the main characters and keeps up the tension. I still think Kylo Ren's lightsaber and outfit, minus the helmet, are cool. BB-8's cute, the humor works for the most part. Having a cowardly stormtrooper with a conscience be a main character is a great idea, and the climactic lightsaber duel in the snow is still, in my opinion, the best part. On the flip side, what they did to Han and Leia's relationship is disappointing, and I know I'm not saying anything that hasn't been said a million times already. Rey shouldn't be an expert pilot, shouldn't be so good at fixing the Millennium Falcon, shouldn't know how to use the Jedi mind trick on the guard, and she picks up on her Force sensitivity way too quickly. That said, in the first film, I do think she's a likable ingenue protagonist. Also, spoiler, if you haven't already seen the movie though, I'm sure you don't care. In hindsight, Han Solo's death is a problem if the theme of the whole trilogy is the redemption of Ben Solo. The writers went a step too far by having him murder his own father, a character beloved by the fans, setting themselves the near impossible task of trying to make fans overlook that little detail later on. In my humble opinion, The Force Awakens isn't a bad film on its own, though it is sorely lacking in originality on many key points, like the antagonists, the super weapon, the sand planet, the cantina. If you're not familiar with the original trilogy, though, that probably isn't an issue for you. How many people watched The Force Awakens who hadn't seen Star Wars before, though? Really, come on. There's also far too much magic, coincidence, convenience, perfect timing, whatever you want to call it. The longer the film goes on, the harder it is to swallow. Moving on, movie number 5 is 2017's Star Wars Episode VIII, The Last Jedi, directed by Rian Johnson. I think when I talked about this before, I stated that I didn't hate this movie as much as other people did. And that's probably because I've never had any deep affection for or attachment to this franchise. Absolutely there was stuff I didn't care about, but that didn't ruin the whole movie for me because that's just par for the course when I'm watching any Star Wars movie. There's always going to be stuff that I'm like, okay, blah blah blah, whatever. After seeing the movie a second time, and especially seeing it in context as the middle entry in a trilogy and knowing what comes next, even though I haven't seen The Rise of Skywalker yet, I absolutely know the spoilers. I still think BB-8 is cute, so there's that. I still think the Force Skype concept, or whatever we're calling it now, is interesting, and I still love that Red Throne Room scene with Rey and Kylo Ren joining forces against Snoke's Praetorian Guard. I've watched that a whole bunch of times. However, much of the dialogue is dumb, juvenile, and excessively contemporary, and a lot of the attempts at humor fall flat. Rey's suddenly much less interesting, lacking the spark she had in the first one that helped me overlook her Mary Sue-ish qualities. They made Finn, the ex-stormtrooper, boring and weak, ignoring his character growth in The Force Awakens in order to make him go through the same journey all over again in a bland subplot. And speaking of demotions, Poe Dameron isn't allowed to be the brave, heroic leader we saw in The Force Awakens, where his hotshot pilot skills saved the day. No, we can't have that. His superiors censure him and hold him back to teach him an inopportune lesson that, coupled with that Kylo Ren, Luke Skywalker non-duel, leaves the audience with the feeling that the movie was a colossal waste of time. It seems that nothing of any real, lasting significance occurs, new characters aren't engaging, and pre-existing ones behave inconsistently with how we'd come to know them in the first film. My biggest takeaway is that this one really doesn't fare well on second viewing. One day later. Well, I watched 2019's Star Wars Episode IX, The Rise of Skywalker, directed by J.J. Abrams, and it wasn't as bad as I expected. Yes, it has some incredibly stupid elements, including but not limited to the return of Emperor Palpatine, Rey being Palpatine's granddaughter, the Snokes in the Snoke clone tank, and that silly I'm Rey Skywalker ending. I guess I had an advantage in that I found out about these lame plot twists shortly after the movie came out, so I've had all this time to not accept them, but to get used to them. They're still stupid, and I don't have to be a Star Wars fan to agree that bringing the Emperor back from the dead when killing him to save Luke was Darth Vader's big redemptive act in Return of the Jedi is a massive insult, and one on a much larger scale than the "they fly now" gag, which I know fans hate because it shows the writers aren't well versed in Star Wars. My other issue is that this is really two movies crammed into one. I couldn't believe how fast it moved from one scene to the next, reintroducing characters and essentially bringing us back to where we were before the Episode 8 detour. And then there's an obvious delineation about halfway through where the second part begins. I had heard people describe the first part of this movie as damage control and a mad scramble to get the trilogy back on track, and that seems accurate. It gives you a little whiplash. But on the flip side, I was relieved to see some of the things I had missed in The Last Jedi, like Rey, Finn, and Poe being a team, which is something I'd expected to see all along. Finn's character development is on target, and he doesn't just spend the whole movie yelling, "Rey, Rey!" and saying, "Rey, I need to tell you something," as I had been led to believe by the internet. Poe Dameron is great here, and Oscar Isaac single-handedly carries a lot of his scenes. The movie might have floundered if it weren't for him, even if he did have to deliver one of the stupidest lines in the entire saga. The bromance is back on, and it clicks, and it makes sense, and we see Rey being trained by Leia, which was surprising, and failing, as she should. I'm still not okay with the use of CGI to put dead people in movies, but I understand they had an issue when Carrie Fisher passed away, and all told, I think the film handled the situation tastefully. I said beforehand that the writers made it difficult for the audience to accept Kylo Ren becoming a good guy by having him murder his father, a beloved character, but I think they managed to pull it off, even if it was once again an imitation of what happened with Vader, including the conversation with Han Solo worked. I think that was a good idea, because if he forgives him and he's rooting for him, it's kind of hard for the audience to hold a grudge. And I'm always up for a redemptive arc, provided it's done right and it feels logical and it's convincing. I suppose one could say, well, that wasn't really Han Solo, that was just a projection of his memory, and so of course he's going to say something that's going to make him feel okay, but I don't really care that much. I do think the dynamics Rey has with the guys in her life are confusing. It seems like the writers weren't sure what to do, or they weren't sure what moviegoers would react best to, so they suggest that first it was Finn could be a possibility, and then all of a sudden I was like, wait a minute, are they making it seem like Poe could be a possible love interest? But then they introduce new love interests to rule both of them out so they can go forward with whatever it is she's got going on with Kylo Ren / Ben Solo. There's certainly an unusual, complicated dynamic there. I can see how some viewers might have been thrown for a loop with how that whole thing turns out. But I think that there was a foundation for it, and they mostly did what they needed to do to make it work. Honestly, when I made the Reylo joke in my mini review of The Last Jedi, I had no idea that they would make it canon. I thought some of the new characters were good additions. There weren't as many pointless people. There were a few noteworthy parts in John Williams' score. There were a couple moments in the story that I found quite moving. And what can I say? It was exciting to hear the voices of the Jedi and pick up on all the different cameos. I was not expecting to see Dennis Lawson pop in for a quick Wedge Antilles cameo. That was cool. Even seeing Ian McDiarmid as the Emperor again was... well... I know it was exciting for him, and he certainly was creepy and seemed to be having fun with it, and I grinned when he said, "Do it!" It was like, he said the thing! So yeah, I am surprised. Not that I thought I would hate it as some other people do, but I didn't think I would feel this positive. And please understand that I'm not saying, oh, this movie was awesome, it was amazing, I can't wait to watch it again. I don't feel that way. But considering what I was bracing myself for and all of the horrible, scathing things that I had heard from many reviews, it really did not seem that bad to me. Maybe it's because my expectations were so low. I don't know. That does happen sometimes. If you set the bar low enough, everything will be better than you expected. But really, I'm glad it ended this way. I don't have to feel like the hours I spent watching these movies were a complete waste of time. And I'm pretty satisfied with the way it concluded, minus that last scene, which doesn't make much sense. As for the whole thing, I think J.J. Abrams, who I'm not actually a big fan of, should have been at the helm for the entire trilogy. I don't know why he wasn't, but a lot of what put people off came when control was given to someone with his own ideas who wasn't on board with the plan, assuming that there was a plan, and I'm not entirely sure about that. It does seem like they didn't have the entire trilogy planned out before they started. If that's the case, that was a mistake. The original trilogy and the prequels had a man with a plan. George Lucas may have made some missteps along the way, but he had a creative vision, and that's what they needed here. Organization, a plan, a predetermined cast of characters, and then they should have stuck with the same writers and the same director to ensure cohesion and consistency in characterization, dialogue, humor style, and understanding of the Force. There's also that lack of originality, though. They basically just rehashed the original trilogy, only focusing on the next generation, with lots of cameos, references, and fan services to try to make people happy and to try to sell a lot of new toys. Unfortunately, Hollywood is obsessed with this formula right now, and they probably won't stop doing it until they've milked every franchise dry. That's a separate subject. I wouldn't mind... Well, it's related, but anyway, I wouldn't mind the rehashing so much if it wasn't such an obvious and sometimes sloppy cut and paste. That Palpatine thing... It's hard to get over that, but I find that I can, in order to enjoy the trilogy well enough, some parts more than others. Here's the thing, all three trilogies have flaws, and annoying side characters, and boring subplots, and slightly uncomfortable elements. But they all also have some good stuff. It's a mixed bag. Every single one of them is a mixed bag. The sequel trilogy has issues. The structure isn't great. Some stuff could have been left out. A lot of stuff in The Last Jedi, I think, could have been left out. Other stuff should have been put in, especially in the first film. They should have taken a more original route with the story and should have had everything planned out first. But they didn't, and it is what it is. Not awesome, not terrible. I was fully prepared to be as cynical about this as everyone else on YouTube, so if you were hoping for that kind of reaction, I'm sorry to disappoint you. But like I've said over and over again, Star Wars isn't really my fandom, so I'm not inclined to go into an apoplectic rage over it. You know what might have prompted that? Try as I have to get into Star Wars, I've never really gotten that enthusiastic. The exception is the Thrawn trilogy by Timothy Zahn. I loved those books. If they had adapted those books into a trilogy and they had ruined it, then I would have been mad. And as a footnote, I don't think what they did here is nearly as bad as what they've been doing to Star Trek. That I can get angry about, and it's all part of an aggressive campaign to ruin everything. But I let other people cover that stuff. Okay, now that I've spent a disproportionate amount of time on that, let's move on to movie number 7, 1948's Deep Waters, in which young Dean Stockwell plays a troubled orphan who is befriended by a Maine lobsterman, played by Dana Andrews, and finds himself called to the fisherman's way of life. Jean Peters co-stars as the social worker whose wariness of the danger at sea prompts her to intervene. It's a good story with a heartwarming resolution and endearing side characters, including Cesar Romero as Andrew's Portuguese assistant, Anne Revere as the no-nonsense woman who takes the boy in, and Ed Begley as a businessman with connections. Plus, it's an unusual role for Dana Andrews, who didn't often share the screen with children. In certain ways, and this isn't a bad thing, it reminded me of two other films, 1937's Captain's Courageous with Spencer Tracy as a Portuguese fisherman opposite Freddie Bartholomew and Lionel Barrymore, and a year after this film, 1949's Down to the Sea in Ships with Richard Widmark, Lionel Barrymore, and Dean Stockwell. I bet some of you didn't even know Dean Stockwell was a successful child star. Movie number 8 was a rewatch of a film I did a mini review of several years ago. I believe it was actually one of my first mini review videos. 2016's Anthropoid, a World War II drama based on real events that stars Cillian Murphy and Jamie Dornan as conspirators who airdrop into German-occupied Czechoslovakia on a mission to assassinate SS General Reinhard Heydrich, the main architect of the final solution and so-called Butcher of Prague. Last month, watching A Quiet Place Part 2, which Cillian Murphy is great in, got me thinking I'd like to revisit this, so I checked Amazon, and what do you know? It's back on Prime. You might never guess, based on how they talk here, that Murphy and Dornan have charming Irish accents. Their characters have an appealing older brother, younger brother sort of relationship, which is not unlike their dynamic in real life, from what I've seen of the press junkets they did together. Cillian Murphy is famously not a natural schmoozer in press tours and interviews, but Dornan was a goofball and helped him loosen up. They're friends, and they're so good together that I think they could pull off a buddy comedy if they wanted to. That's not at all what this is, of course. Anthropoid is quite a heavy film, and they both give strong, sincere, dramatic performances, as do the others in the cast, and several of the supporting actors in the film, which was shot on location in Prague, are native to the country. Directed by Sean Ellis, it's a tense and engrossing film that maintains a laser focus on the preparations, the execution of the plan, and the aftermath. It's a grim film in many ways, but a good one, and like I said, it's a true story. Movie number 9 is 1994's Star Trek Generations, the 7th film in the franchise, and the noteworthy cinematic crossover between the original series cast and the Next Generation cast. I'd seen this at least once or twice as a kid, but since then I'd forgotten a lot of it. I wasn't planning to revisit it, but when my brother wanted to watch it again after all these years, I said, okay. I'm surprised I recognized as much as I did, but for the most part, it was like seeing the film for the first time. For the original series fans, it has a couple big draws. The opening, with Kirk, Scotty, and Chekhov attending the maiden voyage of the Enterprise B, and the famous and much anticipated meeting of the two captains, Kirk and Picard. Primarily, however, it is a next-generation movie featuring the TNG cast and revolving around their predicament with a destructive space anomaly, troublemaking Klingons, and Malcolm McDowell's main antagonist Soren, as well as a subplot where Data has a personality chip installed and struggles with his new emotions, which was probably the part of the film I liked most as a kid, because it's funny when Data gets silly. Generations was commercially successful, but it got a mixed reception, and among Star Trek fans, it continues to be divisive. I thought it was alright. In my previous What Else I Saw video, I talked about Star Trek, and I stated that the 6 original crew Star Trek movies might be my favorite film series. Notice how specific I was. I don't mind this being a TNG movie. I know those characters and I'm familiar with their relationships. I've just never found them, for the most part, I've never found them and their interactions with each other as endearing. So it doesn't have that special appeal for me. I do find some of Generations kind of lackluster and corny, and I don't care for some of the choices that were made. I think you know what I'm talking about. I was also surprised it took so long for the big meeting to finally happen. That was what I was most excited to see, and it took a long time to get there. It was fairly short, and it had that outcome. In a way, the film's kind of a bummer for TOS fans. But I really liked the opening. Patrick Stewart and William Shatner's scenes together were fun while they lasted, and the concept that brought them together presented some interesting philosophical questions. And movie number 10 is a World War II film from 1942, directed by Raoul Walsh, Desperate Journey. A British bomber on a dangerous mission is forced to crash land in Germany, where the surviving crew must use wily means to evade the Nazis and escape the country, carrying with them top-secret documents. The cast features Errol Flynn, Ronald Reagan, Alan Hale, Arthur Kennedy, and Ronald Sinclair, and they represent an Allied mix. Flynn plays a cocky Australian who conveniently speaks German, Reagan is a sassy American, Hale a mischievous Scot, Kennedy a conscientious Canadian, and Sinclair a green Englishman. Flynn, Reagan, and Hale are in competition for who can make the most wisecracks. Meanwhile, hot on their trail is Raymond Massey's infuriated major who had them and lost them, and I was surprised to hear him hurl out more than half his dialogue in German. This film is extremely far-fetched. It's propaganda made to boost morale, so our characters pull off all kinds of crazy stunts while the Germans are comically inept. But it's amusing. There are several lighthearted and even goofy moments, along with a few harder-hitting parts to remind you that this is a real war, but it's mostly banter, tense action scenes, and exciting pursuit sequences. Provided you're in the right mindset, it's entertaining. And that's what else I saw in April. Kind of an unusual collection of films, but that's nothing new here. Before I go, my dad wanted me to tell you all that I did not break the TV a couple weeks ago. He took it apart and was able to report that the capacitor failed. I had nothing to do with it. So there you go. I am absolved and the TV is fixed. I hope you enjoyed this list. If you have seen any of these films yourself, go ahead and share your thoughts in the comments below. I'll be bracing myself for the Star Wars comments, and I'll be back next time with another review. Thanks for watching.